Hello, and welcome to Vital Perspectives. I'm your host, Dr. Marwin Spiller, and our guest today is Kamara Taylor, who is a graduate student at Grand Canyon University. She's a native of Chicago like myself, and that is important because today we're discussing an extremely uh, uh, vital issue, and that is the violence that seems to have gripped Chicago, our hometown. We wanted to talk about that for the next 30 minutes to see what's going on, what can be done, if any, and just to offer a different perspective to that issue. And so we'll just dive right in. We know that Chicago have experienced this sort of uptick, and this uptick has been happening as we talked before we went on air, like since December, things have gotten worse. Having grown up in Chicago, I mean, what do you make of what's happening now versus when you were growing up, high school, and beyond?
Like I said, growing up on the west side of Chicago, approximately 10, 15 years ago, when I was in high school, the culture was different. I mean, for someone to lose their life was almost a shock factor. The community came together. It was like, and we were all in awe, like what's going on? You know, what can we do? There's a lot of different initiatives to take place to make sure that that type of actions in the community wasn't happening. Now I think that it's an expectation. You know, it's almost a bragging right that 30 people got shot on my block. You know,
Yeah.
and not to say that that's the universal expectation for everyone in a community, but for the younger kids, we would say the millenniums, anywhere from the age of now, honestly, from 14 to 25, you know, they have a slogan going on: you're not nobody until somebody kills you.
Okay. Okay.
You know, and just thinking about that slogan itself is stating that the goal is to die in the streets. You know, and that's a difference.
Like a martyr or some sort.
Like a martyr, right?
Yeah.
You know, let's all get T-shirts made. You know,
Yeah.
on Madison.
Yeah.
You know, or on Halstead.
Yeah.
And let's have a celebration and celebrate this person's life because they died in the streets. You know, and I want to be like that person.
Yeah.
I want to be immortalized in that manner. And I think that's totally different than from back in the day. I would say back in the day now, I sound old, but back in the day, like 1996, me being in high school and being around Manly, being around Marshall, you know, the culture was different.
Those are high schools in Chicago.
Those are high schools on the west side of Chicago.
Okay.
And not to say that violence didn't exist, it wasn't to this magnitude.
Okay.
And so I guess today, like with your session, to try to figure out what happened.
Right, right. Because when I was growing up in Chicago, like you said, there was always violence, but the violence seemed to have centered around drugs, money. Some drug deal gone bad. Someone crossed someone about the money, and that sort of drive the violence. And that gang culture was about drugs, about money. But now it seems that it's really not about money anymore. It's not really about drugs anymore. It's something else. Like I think you mentioned, there's a culture
Right.
that's happening. The sociologists would tell us that it's about economics. It's about segregation, and we know that Chicago is one of the most segregated, racially segregated cities in America. Do you buy the argument that has something to do with the violence today?
I think it's a factor. However, if you look at the opportunities that's presented today, it's better than it was 20 years ago, actually. The pay is a little bit better as far as minimum wage has increased. It's more proposed from politicians building in the communities such as Walmarts and Whole Foods that can, although it may not be a six-figure job, it creates new employment opportunities. But I think that it's more so the culture of our young kids in Chicago, and this is a generalized statement, but I think it's more about respect. You know, of course, we can factor in the numerous amount of drugs like lean and X, and you know, that comes into play in making poor decisions.
Right.
But at the end of the day, I think it's less about the socioeconomic status of our young people and more about them wanting to be to have this respect, to be looked at. You know, as we stated before we started speaking, it's a homage to be known as Chirac.
Right.
Like, you know, and that's equivalent to being in Iraq.
Right.
You know,
Right.
and so we kill as many people in Chicago as they do in a war.
Right.
And that's a positive. It's a positive spin looked on it. When our kids like, you know, yeah, I'm from Chirac.
Right.
You know.
Yeah, and certainly it can't go unstated that we're talking about a group of uneducated young people.
Yes.
I mean, not only are they uneducated, they're not working, they are not being productive in the sense that we would sort of measure in terms of mainstream. There's a sociological term, this is idle, the number of idle youth. And certainly being idle, particularly that education piece. I mean, how much does that factor in for you in terms of, you know, it's one thing to want respect and understand respect, but it seems like they have a different understanding of what respect is. Is that a reflection of the lack of education? And if we had better school systems in Chicago, would it be better?
Well, I think if the support systems and the resources was better, and I mean, I'm coming from a political view. When we look at how Chicago is ran, Chicago is a big machine. So those that have lower socioeconomic status is left out. And we see that with the closing of the schools. We see that with the abandoned buildings in the communities. That's an outlet. It used to be an outlet back in the day for drugs to be hid and for gangs to retrieve weapons and things of that nature. But I think today's kids, it's more of a status drug culture. Yes, it's because of lack of education, but I think the education, even with the education, you still have kids that's losing their lives.
Right.
You know, and I think some of the dynamics back in the day that we typically will be able to look at and point our finger from a sociological standpoint and say, hey, yeah, it must be the SES, it must be the socioeconomic status, it has to be the lack of parenting, it has to be this, it has to be that. I think taking into consideration with the different factors that's aligned, like, you know, a lot of these young people that's out in the streets, they didn't have a relationship with their parents because their parents was a part of the 80s and 90s drug culture. So they were the ones that were strung out on drugs. So a lot of the kids that we see that are committing these acts, these violent acts, are kids that's been raised in a foster home. The kids have been raised by grandparents that didn't have the energy and the time like a two-parent home or a single-parent family would take and invest in that kid. So we see that coupled with some of them might themselves be drug babies, and you couple that with intoxication and poor decision making and lack of education, and then you get this influx of violence that we're seeing.
Right.
I don't think it's no longer just based off of, oh, it's this one thing. I think it's a numerous amount of things that's not looked at. It's not looked at politically because 10 years ago people were saying, hey, you know what, that's in Inglewood. Let's leave that in Inglewood because it's not downtown Chicago and it's not bothering our economics here. Or that's in the Austin community, or that's in the North Lawndale community. Let's leave that there. And those are all neighborhoods that's in Chicago. That's in the Auburn Gresham neighborhood. Let's leave that there.
Affluent communities.
That's affluent, like it's not in Hyde Park.
Right.
So we're not worried. But now it's on Michigan Avenue. You know, last summer during a Taste of Chicago, it was a massive shooting right on Michigan Avenue, a big money district.
Right.
You know, for Chicago. So now it's seen as a problem, but we yet to recognize what those real issues are.
Yeah, but and I can, you know, as you were talking, I'm thinking those things are major sort of issues, and certainly a lot of the research have pointed to those issues: lack of fathers in the home, uh, um, lack of education, segregation, racism, all those things. But can't the argument be made that those are issues that affect African American young people all around the country? Those are problems that exist in Philadelphia, problems that exist in New York, problems that exist, in Memphis, and certainly those places all have their own problems and levels of violence. But why is it so much more in Chicago, given that those other places are confronting a lot of the same kinds of social, economic woes?
I think if we look at from a psychological point of view,
Mm-hmm.
it goes back to being the man,
Mm-hmm.
being the woman, because it's not just gender specific when we look at the violence in Chicago.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's less about, at this point, less about socioeconomics. It's less about lack of education, and it's more about psychologically, this is what I'm supposed to do.
That's what you're supposed to do.
This is the new me. This
Right.
is my reputation now.
Right.
This is, I think if we...
Chirac, sort of. I am Chirac.
I am Chirac. It's ingrained. It's like if we went to Hungary and we sat down in Sagad and we didn't eat paprikash, it was like, no, that's you're supposed to do this. You don't say no even if you just finished a full meal at KFC. That's not what you do.
Right.
You embrace that meal.
Right.
And so I think that's what we're doing psychologically.
Right.
Our young people are embracing that imagery.
Right.
They're embracing the Chief Keef.
Yeah.
Like, this is what I do. I smoke all day.
Right.
And then I go kill.
Right.
You say something out of pocket, you're dead.
That's what.
Because
I'm from Chicago.
Because
that's
I'm
what
from
we do in
Chicago. That's what we do.
Yeah.
If we looked at the numbers of LA 20 years ago, because Chicago is the new LA. 20 years ago, when there was that same mentality, but it was more so about gangs then.
Right.
You had the Crips, you had the Bloods. Now it's less even about gang banging and more about reputation of my city. Like, we killers.
Right.
Like, that's what we do. We kill.
Right.
You come here, be prepared. You might not leave with your life. You're
Right.
on vacation.
Right. And
You
we
know,
don't
it's
care where you at, whether
we
you're
don't care
on
where you
Michigan,
at.
West
You're on
Side,
Michigan
South
Avenue,
Side.
South Side, West Side, South suburbs. We shoot on expressways now.
Yeah.
And that's another thing. We're seeing it. We're seeing it go from initially in the inner city communities, in the neighborhoods, to branching out. The massive shootings that's happening on the expressways. And you try to figure out, like, hey, but I thought this was their problem.
Right.
I thought that was an inner city problem. I thought that was an inner city issue. But it's coming to realization that it's a psychological issue that everyone is involved, even if you're not involved. You can be
Right.
on 290. That's a expressway, a major expressway that you take from one side of the town to the next side of the town and into the suburbs.
Right.
But massive shootings.
Yeah. You raised an interesting point. I want to come back to that issue of the psychology of it right after the break. We want to stop here to take a short commercial break, but want to come back on that point.
Gospel Peoria. Tune in Saturday nights at 7:30 on Comcast Cable Channel 22. Watch revealing positive information with various topics, people, and arts. Also, be sure to visit our Gospel Peoria TV Facebook and YouTube channel, where you can watch show segments, information, and updates about the program. That's Gospel Peoria TV on Comcast, Saturdays at 7:30 p.m., Channel 22. Now that's television with an innovative touch.
All right, welcome back to Vital Perspectives. Again, I'm your host, Dr. Marwin Spiller, and we're here today with Kamara Taylor. Both of us are natives of Chicago, and we're talking about the problems that have gripped this big city. You're talking about the psychological effects, and one of the things that has caught my attention is the music that's coming out of Chicago. And the music that's coming out of Chicago, extremely graphic, violent content. And again, certainly graphic, violent content is no stranger to hip hop. But it seems that whereas a lot of mainstream hip hop have moved away from that. Chicago seems to have embraced that. And I'm wondering, is the music violent because the city is violence and the sort of art is reflecting life, or is life reflecting art? And can the argument be made that there is some sort of psychological effect of listening? Like you said, if Chief Keef smoked weed all day, and if you listen to Chief Keef for a couple hours a day, does that, psychologically have some impact, particularly given the community that you're experiencing? Is that a leap? Certainly, this is not an old conversation. I mean, a new conversation regarding the impact of music on one's psychology and behavior. What are your...
Well, I honestly think that in Chicago it's more so fiction, reflecting life.
Okay.
Yes, Chief Keef is a mainstream artist that came from Chicago, signed by a major label, moved to the nice suburbs afterwards, kicked out, a lot of warrants, and had out in LA. But he spends majority of his day skateboarding and paintball shooting, right? Which is not a clear indicator that he's still ingrained in the hood, committing crime,
right,
getting warrants,
right,
shooting at individuals, right? Because the mindset is that let's sell this, let's sell this imagery. So I think because the rest of our entertainment industry have moved away from it, it's still a huge market and something because Chicago is keeping its word on the violence, and numerically that sells,
right?
So they're not going to sign an artist like Kanye, right? Because we have to remember that we have artists like Kanye and Common that come from Chicago that speak in a more positive lit, but 10 years ago couldn't get on the air. But you got Chief Keef that got signed because it's the imagery. Let's sell this image. Spike Lee then named his movie Welcome to Chicago. He named it Chirac. And the imagery of what Chirac is that violence. Even though the connotation was totally different in the movie, that it was that selling of that imagery that this is violence. We're here and we're gonna withhold sex to the violence stop.
Right.
But it's still that sale of this is how violent Chicago is. And so when we talk about the psychological impact of the young people, they want to mimic, not the Chief Keef that's in Los Angeles, living lavishly in his big home. They want to mimic the imagery of the Chief Keef that say, this is what we do, we killers.
Right.
They want that imagery. So we see more and more artists, young artists that's coming from Chicago, if they can make it, because half of them getting killed,
right?
And then that's another dynamic, because if you get killed, then you really own. Right. Now people really want to buy your music and from Chicago and play your music because like you done took bullets, so you really real.
Yeah, you really.
So it's the authenticity, of making it seem like you're very authentic if you're from Chicago and you can say you got shot.
Yeah, and just staying with the point of this. The psychological effect, I wonder about the psychology of those young people and older people. I mean, the grieving process. It seems like there are not adequate avenues for people to grieve, and so you're holding all this in as you're experiencing all this death around you, family, friends, associates, just seeing it all on the news. How much of an effect does that perhaps have on one's psychology? The fact that a lot of folks are depressed, are grieving, are mentally ill, and there are no outlets, because certainly that's an issue. That in our community, we really don't deal with mental illness very well. We still are one of the few communities that reject the notion that we can be mentally ill.
Well, I think that when we go look further deeper into the psyche of the population that we're dealing with now, with our young people in the Chicagoland area, whether it's West Side, South Side, North Side, because it's not just blacks, it's minorities overall. Like you go to Little Village, You know, it's the same issues. It's the same issues. And when we look at the widespread of death, and as you stated, is no proper channels, is no resources, you know, that come into the neighborhood unless it's a kid that's killed. If a kid shot and killed, then you have Father Michael Flagger, you have a lot of other, the rooftop minister, I can't remember his name right now. You have all of these individuals that come on board, but the everyday mourning, the only way people know how to channel that is through aggression. So they lose a loved one in gun violence, and they sit there, they cry, they drink, they smoke, they wear the T-shirts, you know, they bury that person, and then how do they channel that? They channel that through more aggression, because now the only thing to do is to get revenge.
Revenge.
You know, so it's not like, hey, listen, let me properly grieve.
Right.
You know, because this is a process, and it's okay that I lost someone. It's okay that I'm hurt. That hurt turns into anger.
Right.
And then that anger turns into aggression.
Right.
That aggression turns into easy access to guns.
Right.
You know, because that's another issue. We're not talking about a city where we're stabbing each other. We're talking about a underground market that's immediate access of guns is coming in somewhere.
Right.
And we're not talking about little guns.
Right.
You know, no, it's probably not an AR-15 that we heard about in Orlando, but it's enough to make an impact that you're taking many lives at different times. And so without the proper grieving, and it still go back to the psychological impact of our youth, that's what's going on. Without that proper grieving, it turns into aggression. And then that aggression then turns into somebody else mourning, and then it carries on. It carries on. I mean, I lost a cousin to gun violence or the earlier part of last year on the west side of Chicago, gunned down in a hallway and smoking a blunt in the hallway, just gunned down. You know, 8 bullets in him. You know, wrong place at the wrong time. Yeah, but what's the right place? Right. You know, when it's so widespread. Now, I'm convinced that maybe the individuals that killed them sat in the service. Yeah. Because this is not strangers that's killing each other. Right. You know, half the time in the community it's individuals that you went to grammar school with. Yeah. You know?
You said sat in the service of the funeral.
Sat in the service of the funeral. I'm convinced about that. Yeah. You know, because it's not strangers. You know, people that's in the community with you are typically the ones that can cause harm to you, because you're in the same community, you grew up together, you know that person's movement, you know where they're going, and it's still that same psychological impact. You know, what did his brothers do? Well, we're gonna get them dudes. They didn't say, hey, I'm hurting because I lost my brother, you know, and I want this to stop. It's like I have to defend his name by finding out who did this, and if I find them, then then I'm gonna use my Glock, and then it's further going on. So I think it's the psychological impact is way deeper than a dissertation can even hold.
Yeah, and in the short amount of time, I want to just to get your thoughts on how did you make out. I mean, certainly you are a doctoral student working on your PhD in psychology, and there's a long way between that and Chicago, given that most of our peers don't make it out. I was able to make it out. You were able to make it out. How do you explain that? How did you?
I think it goes back to the dynamics of family in a home, to have that support that says, this is a situation we're born into. We have this lower socioeconomic status that you were born into, but that's not where you stay. And I know the sociological point of view says where you're born into, you kind of stay, but to have that support to say, hey, listen, no, you don't have to stay here because that's where you at. It's something greater out there. But I think that the kids right now, the imagery of Chirac, that's their greater. That's their imagery. We go through the Facebook feeds, that's their imagery. So myself personally, family.
Bumping up against that.
Yeah, the family is bumping up against that. The educational system is bumping up against that. The support system is bumping up against that. You know, it's all these other dynamics that's existed. Why I was here. I mean, I remember when Willie Lord held gang meetings on the side of our house. You know, and I had to walk back and forth to school, and it was gang rivalries with the Four Corner Hustlers, Universal Vice Lords. I mean, all the time. You know, but to know that you can be in a community and not be a part of what goes on negatively in a community is the difference. But I think our kids said they don't get that. They think because they're in the community, this what makes them. They have to be a part of this greater imagery of what Chirac is. And this, I can't even believe we call it that is coined Chirac, because that in itself is insulting.
Right.
You know, that in itself is insulting because, I mean, people are losing their lives with no recourse. Individuals that's losing their lives over at a war is based on the premise of, stability, forming a democracy, things of that nature. The only thing we're forming right now is more money to funeral homes, and I think just being able to, being a testament to you're able to make it out, I think it's a mindset too. Yeah. It's a mindset.
It's almost like there's an identity crisis going on. It's like a misplaced identity.
Yeah.
Yeah, we definitely will have to take that one up on another day. We're just about out of time. Thank you for tuning in. Very provocative conversation. We appreciate your time, and good luck to you.
Thank you, Dr. Spiller.
Vital Perspectives, our guest, Kamara Taylor, and your host, Dr. Marwin Spiller. Thank you.